In this presentation, we will begin by watching an example to illustrate what has been explained thus far in this module. After that, we'll complicate matters a little by introducing the intersectional perspective. This video has been produced by Antonio Langarita, Núria Sadurní Pilar Albertín, researchers and lecturers at the University of Girona. Now that we've covered a bit of theory, let's take a look at an example. In this video, there are a number of elements for analysis. If we focus on some specific features, we can see how a great deal of our learning is based on experimenting. Throughout our lives, we do not stop experimenting to learn and understand the world around us and to feel comfortable in it. Of course, the way we experiment with the world changes over life, and it is related to each person's context and their experiences. In this sense, we can also experiment with gender. However, unlike other experiments in life, like learning how to tie one's shoes, when a child or even an adult experiments with gender, a set of disciplinary mechanisms is activated. These mechanisms have a dual function, that is, to sanction and to correct. When a child experiments with gender, the way people around the child interpret this experimentation can vary. On the one hand, people may seem reluctant to welcome such experimenting, and this may turn into explicit or implicit violence towards the child. Another possible reaction is that the people around the child decide to support them in such a way that a gender transition is hurried. However, experimenting with gender may not imply that the child has decided to undergo a gender transition. Maybe they're just experimenting and learning about life, the same way they experiment and try out different food, colors, toys, and so on. The best way to learn what it is that a child is experiencing is to listen to them and to try to understand how they think and feel. In this sense, the video we have just watched shows different manifestations of the structural violence that we explained during the iceberg metaphor. The people around the child in the video interpret their practices as improper, abnormal, and unacceptable. As a result, the child is the subject of physical violence, ignored in class, the butt of laughter at school, stared at both at school and on the street, among other forms of violence, all of which leaves the child feeling dejected and upset and, in the end, makes them change their clothes. Since we cannot talk to this child, we do not know if they think of themselves as a boy, as a girl, or as nothing as such. But what we can be certain of is that the strict rules of gender ultimately make them suffer an enormous amount of violence. Violence and discrimination against LGBTI+ children produces different effects on their lives. What's more, we must be careful and recognize that the effects of violence against LGBTI+ children is not only determined by violent behaviors and attitudes, but also by each subject's previous experience, their support system, the available institutional support, the context of such violence, its frequency, and many other variables. The Fundamental Rights Agency, or FRA, publishes a survey on LGBTI+ people every 5 years or so. In its latest version, which corresponds to data from 2019, the FRA presented different data in relation to violence against LGBTI+ children among the LGBTI+ surveyed people in the EU. The survey respondents were aged 15 years and over. 10% of the survey respondents claimed that they always suffered negative comments or behaviors when they were at school, and 28% responded that they often did. This survey included adults as respondents, but it also included respondents aged 15 to 17, and they are analysed as an age group per se. Some of the data concerning EU teenagers in the 15 to 17 age group reveal that over half, 53% of them, have experienced discrimination in some area of life. Only 32% of respondents had school education that at some point addressed LGBTI issues either positively or in a neutral or balanced manner. 37% of respondents aged 15 to 17 are almost never open about being LGBTI. This survey does not include data on children and young people under the age of 15. In fact, data on LGBTI and gender non-conforming children and young people are scarce. Research carried out on LGBTI plus adults is very enlightening as regards the general status of LGBTI plus rights and well-being. Nevertheless, in the European Union, there is a widespread lack of knowledge as to what LGBTI plus children and young people feel and experience. It is of paramount importance that we gain an awareness of young people's realities on their own terms, to better protect them from violence as well as to build societies free of such violence. Beyond data and statistics, the effects of violence can clearly be seen in particular cases that, while they cannot be transferred to all realities, do actually afford us an insight into some significant aspects. To illustrate this, we shall present a real case here, Alan's story. Alan was a Spaniard teenage trans boy. On Christmas Eve 2017, at the age of 17, he committed suicide. Alan had family support and had in fact been one of the first teenagers in Spain to have his name changed on his official ID according to the gender he identified himself with. Nonetheless, he had suffered from discrimination over the previous number of years. This led to several mental health issues, which included being admitted to hospital for depression. Alan took his own life, so he did not have to return to his secondary school, where he would be forced to see other students who kept bothering him by asking him how he could dress like a man when he had women's breasts. Alan had transferred from another secondary school because he'd already been bullied based on his sexual orientation and gender identity. In 2013, he was first admitted to hospital for major depression after several episodes of self-harm. Following the move to his new school, he started hurting himself again. According to his mother, in his new secondary school, he would get pushed up against the wall, thrown down the stairs, and his shirt pulled up. According to Alan's mother, it was the adults who failed him, professionals who took too long to intervene. In his mother's words, "Teachers know who is who. They know who's a leader and who isn't. They know who's different and who's abusive, who's got power and who suffers. Why don't they ask children from preschool level onwards if they've seen a classmate suffer because of another student? I think what we lacked in our secondary school was a way of finding out if something was going on." When Alan took his own life, his family had just joined an association for trans families. Such organizations are a very good resource for trans children, young people, and their families because they constitute an extended support system which benefits from accumulated experience. So far, we have explained that social structures lead to violence against people who do not adhere to gender and sexuality norms. However, people do not only define themselves in relation to gender and sexuality. Actually, there are several social categories in which people situate themselves. These include class, race, where we live, our origin, and so on. So, violence against LGBTI plus people is not always the result of breaking with sexual and gender norms, but it is also linked to other social categories. Therefore, not all LGBTI plus people have the same level of vulnerability in relation to violence, because LGBTI plus people are not a homogeneous social group. When we evaluate the vulnerability towards violence of a certain LGBTI plus person, we must take other factors into account that we will now examine. People do not identify themselves in only one social category. People are not just gay, heterosexual, intersex, or trans. In Western societies, there are several power structures that operate in unison, are entangled, and together make up a hierarchy of subjects. So, beside the aforementioned gender and sexuality structures, there are other structures in place, particularly those related to racialization, class, bodily capacities, and geopolitical location, among other factors. If we consider the categories of gender and sexuality, we can see that cisgender and heterosexual subject positions are at the top of the hierarchy. And the more we deviate from the norm, the lower down the hierarchy we fall. Something similar happens in the case of the other power structures. In racialization structures, white subject positions are at the top, and the more a subject differs from whiteness, the lower down the hierarchy they fall. In relation to class, subject positions with high economic and cultural capital are at the top, while the bottom part of the hierarchy is occupied by a subject position with little to no economic and cultural power, or rather dispossessed of economic and cultural power. What we just described is but a simple model of a complex entanglement of social relations and structures. While we might think of these power structures as separate, gender, race, class, sexuality, location, ability, etc., they do not operate in isolation from one another. This is what the black feminist thinker Kimberlé Crenshaw called intersectionality. Different power structures that operate as if they were at a road intersection. When we locate ourselves in the middle of the intersection between two or more roads, what roads are we actually standing on? We cannot actually tell one apart from the other. We can also think of it as a handful of entangled yarn that is impossible to unravel. It is just one piece of yarn, and it is indivisible. It is made up of multiple entangled strands. Likewise, we as subjects are one, we are whole, and we are multiple and indivisible strands spun together. The existence of several intertwined axes of oppression bears several implications. On the one hand, we cannot talk about an LGBTI plus subject as single and homogeneous. On the other hand, we must consider LGBTI plus people, and in our case LGBTI plus children and young people, as a wide range of diversities with different situations and needs. As we already mentioned, the axes of power that cut across all subjects are related to hierarchies of power, and this produces two main effects. Firstly, these axes of power translate into axes of oppression for people who are not located in the upper part of any power structure. And secondly, hierarchies in society are related to the intersection in the entangled ball of yarn of social relations in which every subject situates themselves. Hence, two LGBTI plus people can hold very different positions in terms of privilege and oppression. They can actually be radically different depending on their place in the different axes of power. Or, to put it in another way, depending on their subject positions. These subject positions are always built in a relational manner. In other words, they're connected to the context and the set of relationships that each category establishes with the hierarchies of power. Let's try to illustrate what we've just said with an example. On the one hand, we have a lesbian woman. We'll call her Ingrid. Ingrid is white, she lives in a medium-sized European city in a particular neighborhood. On the other hand, another lesbian woman, dark-skinned and of Arab origin. We'll call her Ali. Ali lives in the same city as Ingrid, in the same neighborhood. They both have similar forms of adhering to gender norms, similar bodily capacities, and come from a similar household in terms of class. Ali and Ingrid belong to the same lesbian collective, a collective that defines itself as a safe space for lesbians. However, because of the axes of power that we have just mentioned, white people are used to having more use of space than people of color, and what they say is usually taken into account more readily. As a result, when these two women attend a meeting, the collective tends to listen more to Ingrid's ideas than to those of Ali. An intersectional perspective allows us to realize that it's not that Ingrid has better ideas than Ali, rather that the intersection of the different axes of power bears significant effects on people's everyday lives. In this video, we have addressed three main ideas concerning violence, and particularly violence against LGBTI and gender non-conforming children and young people. 1. Violence is based on social structures. The structures in which anti-LGBTI plus violence is rooted are linked to patriarchal and heterosexual structures as a system. Violence can be physical, but it can also be symbolic, and by using the metaphor of an iceberg, we can understand how visible and invisible violence works. 2. Violence bears effects on people and communities. While violence might just seem to be an incident at a particular moment in time, the violence inflicted on a person affects them at different points in their life. What's more, both visible and invisible violence are markers for the whole community as regards social norms, and they are also reminders of what happens if one breaks the norms. 3. Violence must be analysed from an intersectional perspective. Though we are focusing on matters of gender and sexuality in this course, we cannot forget that there are different axes of oppression that cut across subjects. Hence, when we examine a particular case of violence or means to prevent violence, we have to bear in mind that gender and sexuality are only two axes of oppression in an entanglement of power structures.